here is a report which, is full of numbers and lots of stuff. Sorry. Yeah, and lots of numbers. Let me give you a couple of indications that maybe can guide you through it. And they are, I would say, growth, China, Asia, the export orientation of certain economies, and geographical indications. So there's 5 things that I'll briefly allude to. First of all, growth. Look, this story is, of course, a consistent story and one that we've discussed a lot, but the numbers keep surprising. The numbers really are quite extraordinary. So we had growth in 2016, because that's what we're talking about, 2016, the picture for 2016, of 8.3% for patent applications, 16.4% for trademark applications, 10.4% for design applications, and 8.3% for plant variety applications. Okay, so the first thing that stands out and hits one in the face is the extraordinary growth numbers, because you compare that to the growth in the world economy, and it is a very different picture. And that's been a consistent trend now for a number of years. So we've seen that in patents, 7th year successive growth. In trademarks, 7th year successive growth. So this is not something that can go unnoticed. It's quite, I think, extraordinary. And an indicator of the knowledge economy, and that this particular area is an area where very obviously industry is focused around the world. So the second point then is China. So one of the big drivers, and this is again a consistent story and a consistent trend, of this growth is China. And the numbers from China are quite extraordinary. So in terms of patent applications, 1.3 million patent applications in 2016 filed in China. Now that compares to 3.1 million patent applications worldwide. And the number of patent applications filed in China was more than the combined total of the United States, Japan, Korea, and Europe. So this is, again, something that stands out. It's not something that can go unnoticed. It's quite, even though it's not a new story, but it continues, and it continues in a very pronounced manner. So 1.3 million patent applications, 3.7 million trademark applications, 650,000 design applications. So that leads me to the third point, which is Asia. Again, not a new story, but there's no break in the trend. And Asia was the origin or the source of 64.6% of the total filings worldwide in patents, 60% of total filings worldwide in trademarks, and 69.3% worldwide in designs. So again, something we've seen happening for several years. The trend is confirmed once again. Then let me move to export orientation of the economy. So this is looking at the figures in a slightly different way. It's looking at which countries, when you look at a country's output, let's say, of intellectual property, the number of applications that a country is filing, and then what do they do with those? And it's interesting to look at what the figures tell us about how some countries really are very export-oriented, and that, I think, comes through the number of their domestic applications that they file abroad. And there you see that the US comes out as number 1. So the output, if you like, of US industry and research institutions is internationalized more than others. So in the case of patent applications, those countries which file most abroad are the United States, Japan, Germany, Korea, Republic of Korea. Okay, so in the case of China, huge numbers, but a relatively small percentage of those numbers is in turn filed around the world in other countries. So that's just, I think, a reflection of the stage of growth of the Chinese economy and its orientation. It's a reflection of the extent to which those other economies that I mentioned, US, Japan, Germany, Republic of Korea, are focused on technology in their export operations around the world, or in their operations in other countries. In the case of China, in the case of, trademarks, the top internationalizers of their trademark applications are Switzerland, US, Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden. And we're dealing with a percentage of their applications here. In the case of designs, Switzerland, Sweden, US. So in those figures, you see the US as, obviously very much engaged, very much a user of intellectual property protection in other jurisdictions. Switzerland also, very high. Sweden also. Then perhaps just to say that there are some interesting figures, and we can talk about that later, about some of the middle-income countries and their performance. Particularly, I would say Turkey is one that stands out. And then finally, geographical indications. So this is the first year in which we have sought to reflect the activity that is going on around the world in terms of the protection of geographical indications. So what are geographical indications? You may, we haven't spoken about that much in the past, and you may be interested in that. It's the name of a geographical locality which has associated with it a product whose characteristics, or certain of whose characteristics, are derived essentially from the geography. So the typical case is wine. Bordeaux, Bourgogne, the different wine geographical indications. But you get it a lot in the dairy industry, of course. Mozzarella, Parmesan, other indicators that we have. Now, this has been the subject of considerable international disagreement for at least 20 years, with, broadly speaking, on the one hand, European countries, and I'm speaking very generally, and on the other hand, countries with large immigration populations traditionally, such as the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, Chile. There are different forms of legal protection that apply to geographical indications. But geographical indications are a very important adder of value to a product. The reputation, of course, that goes with a geographical indication can be extremely valuable, an extremely valuable asset. It's the first time we've sought to quantify how much this is used around the world, and we managed to obtain figures from 54 countries, and it's about 42,500 geographical indications protected in those 54 jurisdictions. So there's a lot in the report. That's just a few of the main and salient trends, and we would be happy to discuss them further, particularly my colleagues.
Questions? Anthony Larson, AFP. On the geographical indications, do you have any indication, I know this is the first year you're using it, but about the increase, about how this trend is growing?
Well, look, I'll take something on of a general nature, and then perhaps Carsten or Masai can add to it. Geographical indications are not supposed to rise necessarily in number, because there's a limited geography in the world. What does rise is countries' use of this form of protection, or what seems to rise. So more and more countries are, if you like, becoming aware that their geography confers certain advantages on, in particular, their agricultural produce. Now, whether there are any trends apparent in the numbers in terms of usage, I don't know. I'll turn to my colleagues.
Well, I think the one important thing to point out here, that when we publish statistics on patents and trademarks, most statistics you'll find in the report relate to the number of patents and trademarks that are filed or granted in a given year. For geographical indications, we really focus on sort of the stock of geographical indications. We focus on the number of geographical indications in force. And that's simply because, as the Director General mentioned, in any given year, there are not too many geographical indications that are put forward for protection. Because, and we only now have these data for a single year. In the future, when we collect these data on GIs in force, for every year, we can certainly see how the number is growing. But since this is the first time we are doing this, there isn't anything we can say about trends.
Can I follow up? Did you say that that you've quantified or looked at how much this adds in value to? Can you say anything about that?
Well, we haven't in this report, but our Division of Economics and Statistics have recently published a very interesting report on intangible capital in global value chains. And one of the case studies was coffee, for example. So maybe, Carsten, you can say something about that.
Right. I mean, we can't put a precise figure on the value of geographical indications. There are some academic studies that I think have done that. I think with a very credible methodology for wines. I think there you would find quite reliable estimates. I think what we've shown, though, in the case of coffee, we look at different so-called waves of coffee. And in particular, we look at specialty coffee, which is sort of the latest wave, and where coffee is almost going in the direction of wine, where consumers care a great deal about where the coffee beans are grown, how it was farmed, and so on. And there we, for example, illustrate that the price per kilo of coffee in this third wave pretty much commands 3 times as much, or is 3 times as much as the price of, let's say, regular coffee you buy in supermarkets. That's of course a rough and relatively aggregated estimate. Now, not all of that is due to brand value. It also reflects other elements, notably quality differences. But some of that surely is due to brand value. Again, not all of it necessarily linked to geographical indications. I think brands of individual individual coffee brands that are not necessarily associated with a region also play a role there, but that gives you a sense.
Yes, Frédéric Durand with NHK Japanese TV. I have 2 questions regarding China. You say in the press release that China is increasingly amongst the leaders in global innovation and branding. So does it mean that there is a direct correlation between the number of patents filed and the power, innovation power of a given country? And the second question would be, if we look at absolute numbers, China is really way ahead. So, but it's, as you said, more internally focused. So what does it tell us about the situation of this country?
Right. Well, on the first, patent applications are an indicator of innovation output. So I don't think they're the sole indicator. You know, as is apparent from our Global Innovation Index, it's the innovation ecosystem is quite complex and involves a great number of factors. But by definition, patent application concerns a new piece of technology. And we are dealing with applications, not grants, in these numbers. So grants is whether will indicate whether there is an assessment or evaluation that actually it is a new piece of technology and a significant new piece of technology that goes forward. So they're a good indicator, but they're not the only indicator, you know, about innovation output. And what I think you can say from the numbers from China is that the take-up of the intellectual property system by China is something quite extraordinary. And I think that reflects the strategic approach adopted by the leadership to innovation and the transformation of the economy to greater value addition, the emphasis on intellectual property as an important element in that strategy, and the take-up by Chinese industry and institutions more generally of this lead to actually use intellectual property as an important tool in this increasing emphasis on innovation. Now the second one was...
Inward.
Sorry?
The fact
Okay, so, well, it's an indicator, again, indicator, excuse me, of the transformation of Chinese economy into one which is increasingly based upon value addition, and that value addition finding its way into the activities of the Chinese economy external to China. But let's remember always that it's a huge domestic market. So the domestic market alone, and when you look at some of the figures of the major internet companies, 600 million, 800 million users of the various services that they offer. This is an extraordinary market alone, and you take so for any company there is a huge domestic market for a start, and then of course there's the rest of the world. Carsten, you want to?
No, maybe just to underline the latter point, and you know that as a pure statistical matter, we also report in the World Intellectual Property Indicators these application figures relative to countries' population and relative to market size as measured as gross domestic product. And you know, there what you find, of course, that's not surprising given China's large size. You know, the ratio of patent filings by Chinese origin to population and GDP is still below the equivalent ratio that you have, let's say, for the Republic of Korea, for Japan. And you know, that just statistically goes to say that you know the size of China plays an important role here.
John.
Yeah, I was wondering where in your universe of innovation do you include when someone says Swiss made or US made? Does that fall into which category of the WIPO universe? And I've got a follow-up with the geographical indications. Doing your first initial study, did you come across literature? How many of these geographical innovations are counterfeited? Very well-known cases by industry of their geographical indication appearing in certain markets where they don't export.
Okay, so on the first one, in law generally and in internationally intellectual property law generally, there's always been a rather difficult to define category of unfair competition. And that goes back to the origins of the Paris Convention, and one of the elements of unfair competition is no misrepresentation as to the origin. So there's a general principle that's been around for over 100 years that you can't misrepresent the origin of a product. So when you're saying it's Swiss-made, you're saying it's Swiss-made. And you have to be able to support that. Now, that general principle, I think, is affected by two other things. The first is that, of course, globalization and global value chains has an impact upon that. We're no longer living in economies or in a world in which things are 100% made in one particular country. And that produces a certain tension for some countries in defining the extent of, for example, Swissitude, the extent to which something is. So when you say a Swiss watch is made in Switzerland, what does that mean in terms of the materials, the particular component parts that are used, and so on. So this is quite a difficult question, and I think people grapple with around the world, and it's obviously changing with globalization and global value chains. Then I think you can come to geographical indications, which are a much more precise form of origin demarcation. And of course there are two ways of protecting them, two broad ways of protecting them. One is through a sui generis geographical indication system, such as that practiced by France or Italy, and another is by using a collective or certification trademark, which tends to be the preferred approach of, for example, the United States. But I think that geographical indications are the most precise origin reference. But you have to prove a connection between certain quality characteristics or attributes of the product and the geographical locality. So that might be proved through the soil, the terroir, as they would say in French, the terroir, the soil. It might be proven by human intervention, certain forms of human intervention, some of the methods, the techniques, for example, méthode champenoise, the way in which it's made. So certain things that do actually link the product to the geography. And the second one, John, was...
the level of counterfeiting of the...
Yeah, so look,
my experience,
that's if I'm...
people,
Yeah.
that's quite extensive.
So if I may say, it's a loaded question.
Sure.
Because what is counterfeiting in this area? So the big demarcation, if you like, is between those products or geographical indications which are recognised as being specific, like a trademark, and distinctive, and on the other hand, names, geographical names, that certain jurisdictions would consider have become generic identifiers and not specific or distinctive. And that's the essence of, one of the essences of the trade dispute or tension.
The loaded element of my question, I was more interested in counterfeiting rather
than the different.
Australia saying it's Australian Burgundy.
Yeah. Well, counterfeiting, we don't have any figures on, I'm afraid.
It does exist, though. There is a study by the European Intellectual Property Office that specifically looked at counterfeiting of geographical indications in Europe. And they used, if you're interested, I can point you to it, and it's quite interesting because they used detailed custom records for that, interceptions by customs authorities at the border to trace that. So it's quite interesting.
Peter, then Boris.
Yeah, I'm going to your international filings and large middle income countries. Is it possible for you to give us some comments on South Africa in particular, which is extraordinarily higher than other African countries and is also quite high amongst the middle income countries?
Yeah. Most, have you got them on your head?
I mean,
South Africa?
the figures I can give you in the report, so in 2016 there were 9,711 patent filings in South Africa. I think the one thing to note about South Africa, which you are probably aware of, that South Africa is quite unique in a sense that it has a patent office where you only have formality examination of patents. And I think that makes South Africa quite unique in terms of its patent institution. But certainly, there's we see growth, and in that sense, it's not certainly at the level of China and other countries, but there's significant activity.
It is, as you said, the largest user in Africa.
Right.
Yes, Professor Nelson, a local freelancer.
Okay.
And also the R&D has interest.
Okay. Well, we can. Sorry.
Sorry.
I haven't been through the release yet, but under key numbers and overview, I see only absolute figures and not density, that is per million inhabitants. So although I see Liechtenstein and Bahamas being mentioned, I'm not too surprised that probably Lesotho and Belize are not well positioned, but that probably I could guess even before getting the. My second question is, what was the second question? Yes, your own country, Australia, is trying to fare well by having a lot of incoming, highly qualified Chinese settling down there. Did it push Australia over the year up? And my third question, you probably know that old joke about Khrushchev planting wheat in Russia but cropping it in Canada. And when I hear, for instance, when I see the high ranking of Switzerland in many rankings, at least per investment and per patents, and seeing that new industries and invention are being cropped more in California or in Israel or in South Korea or in India, I wonder what you think of that comparison with Khrushchev's crops.
Right. So on number one,
Yeah.
I'm not sure what the question was, but you're saying this
Does
is
it make
reasonably.
sense to have absolute figures? What does it teach us? Of course, we expect that China will have more patents than maybe not Monaco, I don't know their legal system, but that San Marino, for instance. This is not a great surprise to me.
No, but I think it is very useful to track the trend and to see that the trend has a certain consistency about it. And it's a standout story, I think, and maybe you can say, well, okay, we can see that in various ways, but it tells us, I think, more than just numbers. It tells us, well, there's a consistent trend here. The Chinese economy is changing in nature. It's very different from the economy that was there 15 years ago in terms of its involvement in innovation and in branding and the use of this tool. So, some of this is confirming our basic instinctive intuitions. But I think it's useful to have an empirical basis for the intuitions.
But why no tables with per million?
If you turn to page 71, we have that as well.
71.
71. In the case of patents, and there are other tables for trademarks and industrial designs.
Yeah, okay, that's what I mean.
Yeah. And that and the export, I think, is interesting too. The externalisation of the output is interesting too. Figure. Now on Australia, look, I can't really comment on it to a great extent, except to say that, well, yes, it is a country which, like many others, has placed a great deal of emphasis on innovation. and there have been a number of significant reports by the government recently, in recent years. The current Prime Minister has emphasised this to a great extent. And it's also a country of immigration, and with about 200,000, 250,000 immigrants each year. Part of the immigration policy, like everywhere else, is competition for good human resources. As far as the Chinese population in Australia is concerned, my recollection is that it's around about 2.53% of the total population. Yeah.
In fact, behind my question was, what are the real ingredients to be innovative? Is it the need? Is it the education system? Is it investment? Is it etc.? Because maybe Australia doesn't need to be as innovative as China, but Australia is surely much more. Australians are much more happy than Chinese. So there might be some relation between.
I think it's all of those things that you mentioned, and we also have some good exports, for example, sending it overseas. So look, I think it's all of those things, and it's the magic that everyone is looking for around the world. What's the best mix that gives a vibrant or produces a vibrant innovation ecosystem? And there are many models, but at the basis of it is human resources, of course. So all that goes into encouraging human resources, from the education system through to the sort of opportunities that are made available, and the importation of skills, which everyone is doing, by the way. You know, the United States is doing it, Canada's doing it, Switzerland's doing it. Many, many countries are looking for and creating conditions which are attractive to scientists and researchers.
China and Japan and South Korea.
Well, China's doing a lot in this now. In these Chinese universities are offering some extremely attractive packages for scientists around the world. Some really interesting to stay there. Well, at least to stay there for a significant period of time. Very attractive conditions in universities, in some of the leading universities. So I think everyone's into this.